Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are continuing our series of podcast episodes on shadows. Today we'll be talking about collective shadows for the 3 instincts and the 3 body types. Next episode, we'll talk about the collective shadows associated with types 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Right, and this is a 4-episode series, meaning that we did the 2 previous episodes on individual shadows of each of the 9 types plus the 3 instincts. But now it's time to talk about collective content. And I want to start by saying that I was impressed to see a very good initial content that you had developed for another course you did on shadows, and
Right.
in which you talked about collective shadows. I really like that, maybe because I'm a social dominant. Then I added a few things, but I want to tell our listeners that this is based a lot on your initial research, and therefore I assume that you're going to talk a bit more than I will.
Oh, thank you for giving me that credit. I'm really interested in the topic of the shadow. I think one of the things that Enneagram is most useful for is helping us all see our blind spots and our shadows. And of course, I think of shadow as sort of blind spots plus sort of psychological content that we tend to not be aware of. There are different definitions of the shadow, but at one point, one Jungian author, and Jung, of course, was the figure who probably talked the most about the shadow, and is rightfully the place we often look for the definition of the shadow. And I remember a Jungian author once said that basically the shadow is everything that remains unconscious in us. It's that those parts of ourselves that we either just unconsciously, unwittingly remain unaware of in ourselves, or that we almost consciously avoid looking at or knowing about, because often we think those are parts of ourselves that are unacceptable. They're sort of the dark side of us.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's things about ourselves that have to do with anger or shame or things we're embarrassed of. But there's also something called positive shadow. And some types have more positive attributes in their shadow because they identify more in ego with parts of themselves that aren't so good.
Yeah, I guess that I distinguish blind spots and shadows by thinking that shadows are way harder to own, harder to say that we can have that and do that. Once a wise person told me that as a psychotherapist, when she did work in prisons during some time, she looked inside and told herself that she has never seen any crime that she couldn't have committed herself, which is someone really wise, in touch with our potential for very bad things. And when we come to a certain point of inner work, we really need to see good and bad in each and all of us, not something that there are the good ones and the bad ones. This is a more sophisticated way of seeing reality and seeing people for who they are. And actually, badness and goodness depends highly on the level of awareness that we are vibrating in. And we can change those levels of awareness. So I think it's extremely important to look at shadows if you are doing a very serious inner work examination. And it doesn't mean that uh, you have all of these potential for shadows, or that you will do something bad. And really, we don't want anybody judging themselves here, because it's more a matter of looking at that with some caution, with some fear of ego more than fear of ourselves, and then making sure that with awareness we manage this shadow in ways that when it starts coming up, we relax it down again.
Yes. And if you're interested in this topic, there's a lot of literature about the shadow, again, mostly by Jungians, but there's some rich literature out there if you're interested. I do want to say also that I really appreciate you saying this is not something to start to criticize yourself for it when you hear about the shadow of your type, because the main thing about shadows is that if we become aware of them, they lose their power over us. It's when they stay unconscious, but they drive what we do nonetheless, that we get in trouble. And of course, um, integrating the shadow is such a huge part of the inner work that we all need to do to truly grow to a higher level of awareness. And this is often reflected in the fact that many myths and stories from throughout the world that convey a kind of hero's journey can be also likened to the Enneagram spiritual journey of transformation. And in many of those hero's journey myths, there's often a story about how the hero, which is, all of us in our own lives, in our own stories, needs to go out into the world to face challenges
Mm.
and trials and ultimately like slay the monster or deal with the dragon. And a lot of these kinds of myths are all about the need to integrate the shadow. And these were ways that different people in different cultures all over the world conveyed this really important idea. So a shadow is much often deeper and kind of there's a whole complex to it versus blind spots that are more discreet. But facing the shadow, seeing the shadow, owning the shadow, coming to know it leads to self acceptance. Ultimately, this is what it's all about. It's all about becoming more whole, not unconsciously splitting off parts of ourselves and unconsciously believing or consciously believing like I can't accept this part of myself, I can only focus on this part of myself. This is part of what keeps the ego or the personality in charge of you. This is what maintains the personality's control. When we really have the courage to look at those things in ourselves that we really don't want to see or own, that's when we can make a lot of progress on our inner work. And actually, our personality has less reason for existing because it's a defensive self structure. And some of what it defends us against is being aware of our own shadow.
Right. Yeah. And when it comes to the collective shadows that we are going to talk about today in our next episode, I want to say that we hope that you who are listening right now takes this content in two different ways. One is, am I that type, and therefore should I look into those shadows that are being talked about when I am in the collective? Or maybe if that type is one of my arrow connecting points, maybe I also need to look at that as a possible manifestation of me in my worst when I go to those arrows. But then there is a second aspect, which is, what is my original culture of my country, my family, the organization I work in? Like for you, be as an American, maybe there could be more shadows around point three. For me, as a Brazilian, a bit more shadows connected to point seven, because we usually say that these are the types of these countries. And then I moved to the UK, and there might be more shadows connected to five, which I think has a lot to do with British culture. So maybe look into culture too to see how those shadows play out, not only for you, but around, all around, people around you.
Yes. And another thing I really want to emphasize is that we're talking about the collective shadows because these things are happening in our world today. And they're some of the things that really hurt people, that cause wars and other kinds of social problems and sometimes catastrophes. So But I think that the beautiful thing is we can all do something about reducing the collective shadow in the world, and that is by working on our own individual shadow. The more we become aware of our individual shadows, the less power and force the collective shadows of our cultures have. So hopefully this will inspire you, not discourage you, but it is also important really because wherever there's light, there's a shadow. And so even though there are many good things about, our collective society, our different cultures, if we don't look at the shadow, we're in trouble because we can always be undermined by it. And we see that happening in many places in the world today,
Yeah, there is
including
no
our own
shadow.
countries.
Right. There is no shadow without light. And also, I want to say it will be interesting to also talk about the shadows, collective shadows behind the three instincts, which I think is how we plan to start.
Yes, yes. One more thing I want to say before we start with the three instincts and their shadows is I just want to say that what inspired me to start teaching about this, writing about this, looking into this topic was the work of Claudio Naranjo. And in his book, The Enneagram in Society, or The Enneagram of Society, he writes a bit about this. So some of this I've taken from him. I want to give him credit. Much of it I've built upon some of what he said there. So that was my original inspiration. But when I got writing about it, I thought, wow, this is very important and something very interesting. I think that people who love the Enneagram might want to know about.
Great. So let's go to the three dominant instincts first. When it comes to collective shadows, how do you see the shadows of self preservation collective energy be?
I think the shadow of the self preservation instinct has a lot to do with a kind of selfishness. Of course, if you think about some of your self preservation dominant friends and family members, you might not necessarily think of them as selfish. They may be some of the most generous people you know. And because many of the self-preservation types are, especially when it comes to family and people close to them, extremely generous. However, the shadow of self-preservation has to do with really having an over focus on oneself. It's like a little bit like that saying, every man for himself, or looking out for number one. There's a little bit of under pressure, under stress. And I see this in myself as well. It's almost like I get really sort of my focus narrows to what do I need right now? Or what do I need to survive? Or what do I need that I don't have? And if I don't have it, I'm going to be in big trouble. So there's a little bit of a focus on selfishness, on getting the most that you can for yourself, which can lead to things like stealing, sometimes different forms of corruption that come from, you know, not really thinking about others, but mainly thinking about yourself. Um, but what else would you add to that?
Well, um, there is a term. I'm not sure actually if in the U.S. and Europe this is a term that's well known, but it's known in my country and certainly in all Latin America. It's called. The translation would be wild capitalism, meaning it's the excessive capitalistic stance in which it's all about like getting the best possible negotiation for yourself and not for the other person, or having profits no matter what, and earning as much money as possible, and not really caring about the impact of those things. So I see that a little bit as the collective shadow of the self-press instinct around what is greed, but a greed that is sort of legitimized in society as something that is even seen as good, because then there is the myth that society goes on and prosper because of that. right? And then even economic models that are thought of and social models are created around this shadow of lack of solidarity, actually. And I think it has to do with excessive individualism. And let me say something here. I think that we could even talk about areas of the globe that are more prone to one of the instincts and with all these shadows. So I'll talk about this for all three instincts, but I'd say that for self preservation collective shadow, I would say that possibly North America and Western Europe, because it has a lot to do with the paradigm of individualism, which I'm not saying is bad at all. I'm concerned when it's excessive. Also,
Right. All of these things have a good side and a bad side.
yeah, and the shadow is the bad side of all that, right? And finally, I'd say that the shadow of the self press is also the shadow of doing what's needed to get my part. So what is in it for me? And of course, when that becomes a prevailing mindset, and you're in politics or in big jobs and businesses, then it's not as difficult to jump into temptations connected to making easier, earns and like in corruption. But so that is something that we need to look at. But yeah, that's how I see the collective shadow of self-pres. We could say so much more here. And by the way, we do courses that are advanced retreats in which we go way beyond this and we do work on all of this, and there is so much more content. But to fit all this into a podcast, we need to summarize that. And I
Right.
guess
We're
that,
skimming the surface a bit, talking
yeah,
about the collective shadow. We need to say that
right.
there's a lot more to say than we'll say here.
Yeah, and on shadows, I'm super excited, B, that this year you and I are going to teach about shadows in Thailand, and also later in the year we're going to teach in Iceland, a nice different workshop. But anyway, let's go on. What do you think is the shadow for social instinct, the collective one?
Well, maybe you should start this one since this is your dominant instinct.
Okay, so in terms of the parts of the world, I'd say it's a little bit more Asia, with all the very much more humble approach and less space for individuals. Although there are exceptions within each of these regions, and it's not as easy. But I think that Asia is more like social and a lot of care with the collectivity. And at the same time, there is much more standardization and lack of possibility for people to manifest their individuality, their specific creativity. Perhaps I might be stereotyping here a little bit, but when I compare it with other Western societies, it feels sometimes like in Asian cultures, there is much more um, the concern with offering to everybody a particular standard, and asking everybody to comply. Mostly that everybody needs to comply.
And extended families live together more in Asia and things like that. Yeah.
So I think that one of the shadows of the social instinct is the shadow of us against them, and trying to make our groups superior in different ways, and not necessarily showing that to those other groups. It's a shadow of prevailing, and a shadow of each country or organization wanting to be more than, like standing above with some arrogance about our stuff. Some for some countries it might be wealth, for others it might be food, for others it might be touristic places, and so forth. I think I think another shadow here for the social is persecution.
Well, I didn't really focus on the instincts, so this isn't something, I focused more on the nine types. Um, but I would say that in the social dominant cultures or collectives, it's a little bit like the opposite of what happens in the self-preservation dominant cultures. It's like some of the some of the attention to personal individual needs and safety doesn't get attended to. And here I'm thinking of, for instance, there are countries where that I think are more collective. You can correct me if I'm wrong, where the people drive really crazy on the streets and the highways to the point where it's like there's no sense of safety or personal. Like people are, there's a lot of danger, and when I'm there, I'm like sort of shocked by people aren't driving in an orderly fashion, and there's a lot of chaos, and people can get hurt really easily. So there's almost a little bit of a, oh, we all know what the norms are around driving, and we're all going with the flow kind of thing, and we're all doing it the way everybody does it, but not really paying attention to what some of the problems with that are. What are the personal needs and for safety and survival that kind of don't get attended to because we're following a social norm that has been with us and that we don't question.
Right. I think that in a way that reflects a shadow of the social instinct in which we don't really care about protecting the individual. It's more about the overall of society working, but we don't have that eye to the, each life, So anyway, and maybe that's also a little bit the shadow of the repressed self-press. But anyway, I think we should stick to the dominance here. So let's move on to sexual dominant in the collective shadow. Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
Why don't you start?
Okay. So I think there is, the shadow of not acting on the many abuses that happen in
Mm,
society and leaving them as taboos, as things that are not addressed. And I am talking about sexual abuses, which are, it's so sad to
it's so
see
common. It's shockingly
everywhere.
common.
Be everywhere we go. It doesn't matter, the wealth of the country or where specifically people grew up. It's everywhere, and it's so impressive to see how many people, right?
And it's so shocking the way that, because it stays in the shadow, it often happens in families. And of course, if you've been abused, sexually abused, especially as a child, you're likely, there's a likelihood you'll also become an abuser or have issues and problems in that area of life. And so it's like breaking the chain needs to happen through people doing their inner work. But of course, in many families, a lot of family members remain unconscious and never even come close to working with the shadow. So we find so many people who have suffered sexual abuse of one kind or another, and physical abuse as well. We might put in that category, since there's a shadow of aggression with the sexual instinct and sort of unrestrained aggression. Like I can take out my aggression, I can get my needs met driven by sort of the low side of the sexual instinct, and I don't have to worry about anybody else in a way. It's just my needs getting met, or my need for sort of expressing my aggression in some of these very unhealthy ways.
Yeah, and I do think that sexual instinct has to do with aggression in many ways. And also, I would say more like in the sexual sense of it, but not exactly necessarily in the sexual abuse part. The macho culture is a little bit something that comes from the sexual instinct. Like men dominating women, and so many cultures, be like in
Domestic violence. I think that would be another thing in this category. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence. Yeah.
Also violence against kids, because the sexual instinct, when distorted, is about dominating, and overextending my strength over
And
someone
my
else,
control.
my control. Yeah. Then finally, I'd say what happens inside walls, that people, other people don't see, and then it becomes a secret, and it's only between you and I. So it's a little bit also the sexual thing. What would you add?
Yeah, one last thing I wanna say about porn is I think a lot of people are into porn. As a psychotherapist, I worked with a lot of people who had pornography addictions, and I always tried to sort of normalize it in a way, but I think what it's about is a need for connection that doesn't get fulfilled, and so the need for sex kind of sort of takes over, and because so many of us in our culture don't work on the shadows of that need for connection or the need for sexual contact. We don't, a lot of families can't talk about sex and the different things. It's almost like the epidemic of not having intimacy and connection in healthy ways that we really want sort of gets acted out on the down low with addictions to porn, which is kind of like an objectification, a substitute for actual sexual intimacy act through just sort of being able to just kind of have some sort of satisfaction that's easier to access.
And people, when having sex, using sex just as a release, and that is just, a shallow part of what's true and more sacred sexuality is. So I just wanted to add this.
Okay, so shall we go to, on that note, should we go to the first three types that we'll talk about in this episode? Eight, nine, and one.
And let's start with the shadow of body types as a whole, and then we talk about eights and nines and ones. Okay. So,
And again, in this episode, we're only going to talk, I'm just going to share a little bit of the content I've developed because again, there's, too much for
right.
a podcast
Yeah.
episode. So just know that there are many others examples that we're developing, but we'll just
Yeah,
share
and
one or
things
two
we
here.
can do about all of those, right? It's also what we worked on during retreats, but it's impossible to do with podcasts. So,
Yeah, examples of positive outcomes when the shadow is integrated.
starting with the whole triad, I'd say that body types, eights, nines, and ones, have a shadow of judgment, and that is a lot about seeing that there is one right way of doing things. And we did cover this during the first two episodes on individual shadow, but in the collective side of this, it's societies that are not too inclusive, societies that go against minorities, go against the different, and want to standardize people too much. And even when it comes to career choices, there are fewer, and there is more the tendency to value only things that are productive, that are based on doing, and not necessarily things that are more abstract and that are so important for society. So I think that unfortunately it leads to things like undervaluing art or undervaluing more subjectivity. And I also think that another shadow of the body type in all of us is something like being more territorial, being more aggressive when it comes to invaders, and being always defensive in a way, but also by being offensive. This fight mentality of either attacking or defending, but always protecting my territory, not in a self-pressy way, but more like a territorial thing that we see so much with body types. What would you add about the triad? Maybe something.
No, I think I'm ready to go on to type 8.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, so collective examples of the type 8 shadow. I would say sometimes we see this when, for instance, police use too much force and power because they don't adequately make conscious and deal with their essential vulnerability or stress, right? If it's like you have a police force in collective society that is in charge of protecting people and enforcing law and order, but if and but those the police force, and again we're talking more about the collective here, if they don't take care of the individual needs of police officers, if they don't give them the right training to understand, they don't give them the right support. I mean, I think I always empathize a lot with police officers because their job is so hard and they often don't get paid that well. And they're, in a way, putting their life on the line every day. And that's vulnerable. But I think often there isn't enough support for people to integrate that vulnerability and be more conscious of it. And so when you don't integrate vulnerability, you overcompensate through being too dominant, too powerful, and using power and force excessively in ways that hurt people and end up hurting yourself. And this can extend to leaders generally of societies, leaders who use too much force to maintain their positions of power or self interest rather than submitting to the will of the people or doing the right thing because of a moral or collective need of society, recognizing that you're just a person, with you're a human being. Some we see some leaders try to get more and more power, and once they get a certain amount of power they try to use that to get more power. So it's sort of like power for power's sake, and there's not enough recognition of either the collective or a deeper kind of vulnerability or humanness or equality to other people, such that there is this drive to of one group of people to put themselves above others and do whatever they want without regard to any limitation on what they do.
Right. Yeah, important points. And I'll add just one. When it comes, for instance, to justice models, I think that the body type instinctual shadow is focusing way more in the punishment than in the restorative kind of justice. Like even to points that we think of eye for an eye mindset, like in Middle Ages. So it's yeah. Mhm.
Or would
Yeah,
that include like the excesses of the prison system? I
yeah.
know in the US, the prison system is horrible, and it's just all about punishment, and um, guards misbehave and are corrupt and take out their own aggression on the incarcerated people. And like you say, there's not as much restorative or rehabilitation work, so that people can reenter society. It's just like put them away and don't think about them, don't take care of them, and they get really brutalized in horrific ways. And I think that's another example.
Just believe me that it can be way worse than you experience in the US, in countries like Brazil. I'm afraid I need to
Wow.
say that.
Yeah,
And
probably all over the world, that's a problem.
yeah, and something about everything being a yes or no, like guilty or not guilty, as if that was this simple, and then having a definite judgment. But let's go on to nine.
Were we going to share a little bit about what the good things that happen when we integrate the shadow?
Yeah, why don't you say one or two of those?
Okay. So, for instance, when we have really positive police reform, sticking with the policing example, to act to support the people of the community, right? So when policing becomes more about, and we have something here called community policing that we've tried locally here where I live in San Francisco, where police actually go out and get to know people, right? And they form relationships. And I think an important part of all police reform should be like supporting the actual police officers, like helping give them the best possible training, helping reform what police do so that they're not having to act. Here we have a lot of situations where they're sort of being asked to act as therapists, in domestic violence situations, things like that. They're asked to do things they're not really qualified to do, and that's makes them even more vulnerable. But of course they also aren't given the support, therapy, different kinds of resources that they would need to really be supported in their own experience, such that they could be more aware. And also with leaders, when leaders model forgiveness and actions that promote healing, and they really put aside their own needs for the needs of the community or the needs of the people.
Beautiful. I would add one thing that I see as super positive. I see that when leaders that are body types evolve, they come from a higher level of awareness, they become icons of peace culture, icons of tolerance. So Mandela, Gandhi, and Luther King, in my view, were all body types. And I think they exemplify the opposite of the bad shadows we talked about here.
Yeah. Yeah, and remember there are many different examples of shadows for every type. We're just mentioning one or two. So let's talk about type 9. I think a really good example of the collective manifestation of the 9 archetype, of the shadow of the 9 archetype, is dysfunctional bureaucracies that get caught up in inertia and routines and systemically resist change. Claudio Naranjo gives the example of education systems. Education systems are notorious for, you know, getting so bureaucratic and going always going with the status quo and avoiding necessary conflicts and discussions and changes that would actually help improve things continually, sort of be, creating reform in response to feedback, making things better. But any kind of sort of bureaucracy where you have a big system running something, and of course, sometimes this is what some groups say about government generally. Like government is bad, government is, it creates more problems than it solves. But of course, I think there's a shadow to that movement too. I think it's government can do really good, important things. We need good government. But of course, one of the bad manifestations of some forms of government is getting excessively bureaucratic, where nothing gets done, where change can't occur, where there's no input into the system that's making it better and more responsive and being able to get things done.
Mhm. Yeah, I really think your points are important. I think that sometimes standardizations also come from this nine force, in which everything becomes not only a routine, but also like, I lack the words in English right now, but it's more like not individualized enough or expressive enough. And I think that that might connect a little bit to this force of point nine.
And I think there are, of course, a lot of problems that result in society when any collective isn't able to have necessary conflicts that are that make things better. You and I
Mhm.
are both work in organization development sometimes, and in organization development, there's a well-known team stage model. And the stages of a high performing team are forming, storming, norming, and performing. And that storming stage is really important. You know, you have to have conflicts in order to get to a high level of performance in any team, or I would argue a collective. And if there's something in the system that isn't hearing feedback, that isn't having a necessary discussion, debate, conflict in order to make things better, then things stay stuck. And it's like a mechanical process for process sake way of doing things.
Right. Yeah. Super important. Fear of conflict leads to, some episodes of worse aggression all of a sudden, just like nines, don't explode, don't explode, don't explode, and then years later have the worst possible explosion. Sometimes that can happen in societies. Accumulated frustration that doesn't get channeled properly and then leads to very bad episodes.
Right. And when nines don't do their inner work to wake up to themselves, especially, they can get caught in a kind of mechanical behavior. And so any kind of um, collective that like tends toward automation or being too mechanical and not bringing in sort of more insight, more humanity, can also be something that where we see sort of this nine shadow of not wanting to pay attention
Mm,
to what's really happening.
right. Super important. Do you want to move to the positives of nine?
Yeah. So again, the beauty of looking at the shadow is it helps us see what we need to attend to make things better and to prevent the shadow from overwhelming us and causing really big problems. And of course, when we're talking about collective shadow, we can be talking about really big problems like war or breakdown of society or social structures. Democracy is being threatened in many areas of the world today, and if you like democracy, then you know it, and you see some of the problems in autocracy. That's worrisome, and so that can be part of this. But when we make an effort to see this shadow and to see the type 9 shadow in society, reform and revolutionary change of institutions driven by sometimes appropriate anger for the need for change channeled into right action can happen, right? So it's so we can wake up to what's not working and the pain of it. And we can, through dialogue, maybe sometimes contentious dialogue, come to the heart of the matter of what the problems are, what the pain points are, what needs to be changed. You know, the same way healthy nines aren't afraid to wake up and feel their emotions at a deeper level, get in touch with their anger, express their opinions, their anger, and not worry so much about upsetting other people, and taking action, you know, to address specific social problems. Or, for instance, if we stick with the education bureaucracy example, taking action to see what's not working in this system, and how can we address that through change, and how can we question the status quo and surface uh, problems so that we can develop solutions to problems in a more conscious way and not just kind of mechanically keep going with the status quo. Because, for instance, unions get involved, and you know, there are great things that unions do for workers, but there are also the downside, the shadow side of unions is kind of sticking with what they've always done and not changing with the times, to the point where people go against unions and the good parts of what they do can't be involved in business because they've stuck too much with the status quo. They haven't allowed for change, and so people go against them.
Yeah, or even use passive aggressive methods or stubbornness, right? In the way they position themselves.
Stubbornness and inertia is a lot of what times stops change from happening, positive change.
Right. I was going to add just one thing, but you touched the point, and that is when we all collective work on the shadow of nine, we go to more higher level confrontation of opinions, positions, but also policies, collectively. So that might be a good thing to overcome that set of shadows.
Yeah. So, should we talk about the collective shadow of type 1?
Yes, and please start.
So, here, again, there are many examples we could point to and probably will at some point. But the one I would point to right away is organized religion. And here I'm not talking about spirituality or religion generally. I'm talking about specific instances or examples of organized religion when spiritual growth and guidance becomes more about rules and dogma than true spiritual experience and development. It's like when religious leaders use their position and role to enforce good behavior excessively out of this sort of more egoic desire for power and control rather than true spiritual values of kindness, love, and things like that.
Right, good points. While you were talking, a point that came to me that I want to add is the shadow, for instance, of how we all in all societies dealt with mental health issues decades ago. Like just seeing it as something abnormal that needed to be extirpated right away, no matter what. And then with methods that were really cruel to mental health patients in hospitals, mental health hospitals. I can't even watch movies that talk about that and show things like that. I remember now one flew over the cuckoo's nest with Jack Nicholson. So I think that is a little bit of the shadow, the collective shadow for once, but not only on mental health, but in everything in society. I think that excessive discipline in schools, and really making sure that everything that's a bit different from the normal in math and statistics sense of the word is corrected.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I know that I've encountered a lot of, say, young people who grew up in a religious, um, community, who are still very committed to their faith tradition, but sometimes get turned off by some of the more um, more unforgiving or more rules based forms of organized religion, where at some point the religion itself becomes much more about controlling people or policing people
Right.
instead of promoting their well-being or promoting their spiritual
Hmm.
experience. And there's a quote that I have here that I think is from Naranjo, which I like, and he says, a culture that is saturated with prohibitions and demands can hardly promote the capacity for surrender. I really like that quote because I think that's at a higher level what true spiritual work is about, is at a certain point surrendering to something higher.
Right.
But a lot of the way many religions have evolved, they become empty of their original spiritual purpose and become more about us versus them, some of the social dominant shadow you talked about, but also a little bit more about you have to follow these rules, otherwise you're a bad person,
Hmm.
which is really simplistic and um,
Hmm.
not the way things might be to support people's true spiritual attainment.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing your points.
So, the positive aspects that can occur, that are possible when we address, see, own the shadow of the collective type 1, and again, taking organized religion again as an example. When leaders, I mean, again, another point about um, organized religion is we've had, a little bit together with what we talked about in terms of the sexual instinct. We've had instances where people, act out their shadow individually, and it goes, and people get away with things because they're part of a church or part of a particular religious structure. So the positive outcomes are when leaders in these organizations model forgiveness, model true spiritual behavior or actions that promote healing and growth and understanding. And when religious leaders are doing their own work and they stick to the essential core or purpose or message of love or kindness or humility, when they can blend order and collective structure with guidance, true guidance about spiritual growth, and without sort of any kind of corrupt influence getting involved. When we can, for instance, when say if talking about say a Christian religious community, when people can stick with sort of the ideas that Jesus taught, for instance, instead of creating rules like these kinds of people are unacceptable or those kind of people are going to hell, then I think you getting this sort of egoic human uh, kind of shadow involved instead, which gets in the way of true spiritual or true Christian or true any kind of religion, true attainment, true progress on a path that leads to uh, something higher.
Mm. Yeah, I will add just one thing, B. I think one thing that might be good to explore as a solution for the type 1 collective shadow is the creative chaos theory. And I know Andrea Rabe as someone who created that kind of approach in books and also his work with his wife in Africa. So I think that that is something that might come up with some good work of overcoming type 1 shadows.
Yeah, and if we look back at some more ancient spiritual traditions, and I think that are connected to the Enneagram at its roots, we find that a lot of these older spiritual traditions that are more toward the core of their original purpose, we find that those tend to not be based on rules. Like you have to follow this, or you have to believe in this, or you have to do this way to be accepted in this group. Like a lot of older spiritual traditions, especially those that are more mystical, aren't really about control or rules, or you have to do it this way. There's a right way and a wrong way to express something. And I think that when we see that that's going on, it helps us address it more.
Beautiful.
It's time for our top five.
And what's our top 5 today, B?
So, our top five today is the most sentimental.
Good. I have prepared, but I, as a Brazilian non native English speaker, I had to really look it up at the dictionary, the right meaning of sentimental.
So did I. So, it's not just you as a non native English speaker. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood what we're meaning when we say the most sentimental.
Yeah, because in Latin languages, at least, that can be very easily misunderstood. So, can you explain us what that means?
Yes. So, sentimental means, and there's a couple of definitions, a marked or governed by feeling, sensibility, or emotional idealism. And then the second definition is resulting from feeling rather than reason or thought, a sentimental attachment. So I think it has a little bit of a flavor of emotional idealism, like a little bit of a romanticized, like a tendency to romanticize, tendency to have a lot of feeling about something. And I think that what marks sentimentality is it's it's sort of an excessive feeling of what you might sometimes expect. Like for instance, some people really like they get sentimental about a certain kind of experience or a certain kind of thing that they do. Like every year we go and do this, and a lot of and people have sort of it's idealistic and have a lot of emotional attachment to that.
Yeah, so I just want to say that it doesn't have much to do then with being dramatic, because
No.
this is the risk when we translate it into some other languages like Latin languages, okay?
Yeah.
And then also it does not have to do with necessarily being romantic. It's a bit more like empathetic, making connections, being a good listener, and feeling things deeply, but also caring about others. Uh, so, am I right in what I'm saying?
Not exactly. I would
Hmm.
say it's on the way to being romantic. It's not exactly being excessively romantic, which has a particular connotation. It's a little
Hmm.
bit more excessive emotional attachment. It's a
Okay.
little bit like, I mean, I like the term emotional idealism, and
Hmm.
coming a little more from feeling than thought. Like it might not I might not be able to explain why I have a sentimental attachment to a particular book. You might look at that book and say, well, that's sort of an ordinary book. And I might say, well, I feel really sentimental about that book. Maybe it reminds me of something from my childhood or something like that. It's like a slightly more excessive emotional attachment that comes from a kind of some sort of ideal about what that represents.
Okay, so what's your fifth?
So my fifth, so you're all okay with that?
Yes, yes, I guess,
Okay.
yes.
All right. So my fifth was type six,
Mm,
maybe a little more self preservation six.
mm,
And even though I don't think that sixes are the most sentimental, I do think that especially the self preservation six can be a little more warm and affectionate, a little more, even though they're basically very mental, can be sort of more, a little more emotional on the outside and can sometimes, especially find certain things that make them feel safe. They can get a bit of a sentimental attachment to them. But again, I stretched a little bit to make an argument for six, but it is my number five.
okay, to me, it's type three. I think that threes are emotional in the inside mostly, and they don't show that, but they can be very sentimental in many ways, and that comes up in episodes. I think of you know threes demonstrating all of that. Maybe not as often as other types though, but it depends also on how that is accepted by people and environments around the three. Then the three will be much more like that, because I think that deep inside they are like that. And so at the same time they contain that a lot. So uh, this is why it's my number five.
Yeah, I think if we were considering levels of awareness, when I thought of three, I thought of the more basic three, maybe at lower level of awareness. And then I thought maybe not, but I totally agree with you. If we think about a three who's done even a little bit of work on themselves, I agree. So my number four is nine.
Mm,
Again, not at the top of the list, but I think sometimes nines can have a particular sort of sentimental attachment to some things. And sometimes part of that can come from their sometimes resistance to change.
mm,
Like I stick with this thing because I feel sentimental about it.
interesting. I didn't include nine because I guess I was looking really only into emotions and not instincts. But yeah, I get your point. And well, my number four is a subtype as well as my third. It's a sexual seven. I think that sexual sevens can have that and be in the idealization and intensity and expression. They can be quite like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's why seven is my number three. And I did put a little note by it. I put sexual slash social. So I
Hmm.
don't think self preservation sevens are very sentimental, although I've met a few that could be. But I think it's more the sexual or social. But I put seven as my number three because I think sevens can be, they can kind of build up an emotional attachment to certain things that they really like.
My number three is sexual eight. A little bit like the sexual seven, but I think it's more like expressing, not as much in the empathetic side, but I think they can be like that. Perhaps the social eight too, and definitely not as much the self-press eight. I don't see as much different from the seven, but I'm curious about your opinion about this.
Yeah, I didn't include eight. I thought about eight for a minute and I found it hard to see them as sentimental, but I think you're right that the sexual eight probably is. So I think you could persuade me of that. My number two is type four, because I think fours, even though sentimental isn't at the top of the list of how I would describe fours, I think many fours can be sentimental because if we're talking about being emotional or emotional attachment or having certain kinds of nuanced feelings about certain things or experiences, I think fours do that a lot.
Me too. I have four as my second. And I was in a doubt between this and my first, but I ended up having four as my second for similar reasons. But what is your first that I assume is mine too?
Yeah, I think we probably have the same first, and that's number two, uh,
Correct.
because I
Yes.
think twos are probably, you know, I don't like to admit it, but twos can be very sentimental.
So why don't you explain that on our behalf?
And make it easier on you. Yeah, twos, I think, while they may not always, especially self-pres twos, like express their emotions really outwardly, sometimes they do, and sometimes they develop really strong emotional attachments to people and things and experiences. They live in their hearts a lot, and they live in, I would say, emotional idealism might be a good way to put it. I remember when I was young, when I was a young two, I had a lot of fantasies about relationships, a lot of fantasied relationships that were a bit romanticized or sentimental. And I would definitely develop strong emotional feelings about certain people or certain things or certain experiences or certain events. And it's over my life, I think, working on myself. One of the things I've tried to do is not to be so driven by my emotionals or my emotional attachments. It's sometimes when I get an emotional attachment, and especially to a person, I can find it really hard to break that because I sort of tell myself a story around it about how great it is or how wonderful this person is. And sometimes that story persists in the face of contrary evidence. So
Mhm.
actually, that person's not very good for you, but you really see them with a kind of a rosy aura around them.
Mhm.
And that's happened to me in life. So I think there's a way that twos can be very emotional, not always like crying, showing a lot of emotional, although they can at times. But sometimes the emotion kind of gets channeled into being dedicated to certain people or devoted to certain things. And that can come from a kind of sentimentality and emotional attachment or idealistic view, idealistic emotional view of someone or something. And so I put two at number one.
Okay. Okay. So choose the champion for today.
Which is not necessarily, I mean, again, it's not bad to be sentimental, but I'm not exactly proud of my emotional attachments either.
Okay, thank you so much, B. It was a rich conversation. And next episode, we're going to talk about collective shadows for heart and the head triads.
Yes. All right, so that does it for this episode. Please join us again for our next episode when we talk about all things Enneagram here at our Enneagram 2